Hello everyone, and welcome to the Mathematical Experience. Today, we're going to be starting a new book called Flatland, A Romance of Many Dimensions. Now, this book was recommended to me by one of my professors here at college. And that class, it's kind of mathematical. It's informal logic, that's the title of the class. But he says it deals with a lot of mathematical logic, discrete mathematics, and such. So I decided to pick it up from the library and give it a read. So, as I said, the title is Flatland, A Romance of Many Dimensions. It's by Edwin A. Abbott, if you want to pick it up yourself. And this particular version has a foreword by Isaac Asimov, I believe his name is spelled or pronounced. Actually, a little side note, I think I've heard of Isaac Asimov before. I think he was once quoted as saying he would, while he was at college, he would take all of the textbooks at the beginning of the semester and read through them. Through like the first 2 weeks, you just read all the textbooks, and how that just exponentialized his learning. Is that a word? Exponentialized? Anyway, who cares? Let's move on. So, let's see. There's a little blurb about the author. I'll read it. So, Edwin Abbott. I don't know if that's a typo or it actually is his middle name. He was born in 1838, and he died in 1926. He's been ranked as one of the leading scholars and theologians of the Victorian era. He received highest honors in mathematics, classics, and theology at St. John's College in Cambridge, and in 1862 began a brilliant career, during which he served as a schoolmaster of some of England's outstanding schools. At the same time, he distinguished himself as a scholar, and in 1889, he retired to his studies. Although Flatland, a literary jeu d'esprit, has given pleasure to thousands of readers over many generations, Abbott is best known for his scholarly works, especially his Shakespearean grammar and his Life of Francis Bacon, and for a number of theological discussions. Okay. So, apparently this book is a lot like that. It deals... Actually, I don't know much about it. All I was told by my professor was that it was very controversial when it came out. And it introduced a lot of topics about sexism and racism and social constructs using this logical and mathematical kind of arena, so to speak. Alright. Let's turn a few pages past the copyright stuff and all that. Okay, so the foreword here is called Limitations, and again it's by Isaac Asimov. It says, a little over a century ago, Flatland was published anonymously. It was a book written for amusement, his own as well as that of his readers, by a grave and serious Shakespearean scholar, Edwin A. Abbott. So exuberant was its demonstration of imaginative power, and so swifty in its satirical description of an alien society, that it achieved a popularity that has never diminished. To this day, it is probably the best introduction one can find into the manner of perceiving dimensions. We are made to understand the way in which the inhabitants of Pointland, 0 dimensions, Lineland, 1 dimension, and Flatland, 2 dimensions, are satisfied with their universes. They are not only incapable of understanding the limitations of their view, but are enraged by any attempt to enforce them to transcend these limitations. We might well imagine that we, from our superior viewpoint of 3 dimensions, faced with no fewer than 3 stages of transcendence, from point to line, from line to plane, from plane to solid, would be ready to understand the concept of step-by-step increase of dimensional number without end. Certainly, we could accept and understand a universe of 4 spatial dimensions. Not so. Abbott shows how an inhabitant of Spaceland, our own familiar 3-dimensional universe, after explaining in detail the 2-dimensional limitations of Flatland and forcing an inhabitant of the plane to accept the additional dimension, himself falls into a rage when asked to contemplate a 4th dimension. And this is true of 3-dimensional beings, we ourselves, generally. One of the problems faced by anyone trying to understand Einstein's theory of relativity is that it forces us to look at the universe as more than 3-dimensional. We must accept time as a kind of 4th dimension, through one somewhat different in its properties from the other 3, which introduces yet an additional level of complexity. One escape from that problem is to seek refuge in mathematical representations without inspiring too deeply into the geometric significance of the equations. Flatland, however, gains further significance if it is viewed not merely as a matter of dimensions, but as a study of the human mind and its attitude towards limitations generally. If a limitation is inherent because of a body's physical limitations, how can one round it? How does one explain color to someone who has been blind from birth, or music to someone who has been deaf from birth? One can explain the different wavelengths of light and of sound. One can refer to analogous differences in sensations that can be experienced, such as those of touch. An intellectual understanding can be reached, perhaps, but never can this compare with the level of comprehension that the sight of a garden or the sound of a Beethoven symphony, even if only for a few seconds, could bring about. But what about the limitations that represent only an ingrained habit of thinking? The Flatlanders accept not only their 2-dimensionality as an unarguable law of nature, but also the mental inferiority of women. Yet while the sphere tries to correct the 2-dimensional limitation, he made no effort whatever to enlighten the Flatlander over the matter of feminine inferiority. But then, this Flatland attitude reflected the common British attitude in Victorian days, as did the set-in-stone class distinctions of Flatland, and we may suspect that the author himself may have participated in those now antiquated social views, although he was totally enlightened with respect to dimensionality. This book, then, should lead us to the question, the limitations we set to our universe generally, not only those that are mathematical and physical, but those that are sociological as well. How far are our assumptions justified, and to what extent are they merely careless or self-serving misinterpretations of reality? Oddly enough, the casual acceptance of unnecessary or wrongful limitations has its obverse as well. The limitations we live with constantly, or that we have been brought up to believe, we tend to accept without question. Not so with limitations that lie outside our ordinary experience, even though such limitations may be very real. For instance, we are accustomed to the fact that no matter how rapidly an object is moving, applying a force in the direction of motion will cause it to move faster. Every time you step on the accelerator of your car, you are making that assumption, and your car invariably behaves in such a way as to bear it out. That, however, is only true at comparatively low speeds. As speeds become greater and greater, forces become less and less effective in making the speed increase further. It turns out, therefore, that the speed of light in a vacuum, 186,282.4 miles per second, represents an absolute maximum speed for any material object. It was Einstein in 1905 who first discovered this limitation to our universe. Yet this is one aspect of the theory of relativity that laymen seem most unwilling to accept. The question that is invariably raised is, why can't we move faster than light? What's to stop us? Why can't we just keep the rocket jets going and move faster and faster and faster? The best argument in response is that we can't do so because that limitation is part of our universe, just as our own existence is. If the limitation did not exist, or it were different in detail, then the universe might still exist, but it wouldn't be our universe. It might even conceivably be a universe in which some other limitation would be introduced that would make our kind of life impossible. Might not Flatlanders, in similar fashion, simply dismiss all chance of a third dimension by saying that the inability for more than two dimensions to exist in the case of any material object is a limitation that is simply part of the Flatland universe? In a three-dimensional universe, they might insist other limitations would exist that would make Flatland and Flatland life impossible. And yet, since we can easily imagine a universe transcending Flatland, might there conceivably some universe transcending ours, in which the speed of light limit does not exist? And might we, at least temporarily, work out a way to enter that transcendence as the hero of Flatland lifts out his own universe for a time? Certainly, in my own science fiction stories, I routinely allow my character to, quote, jump through something I call, quote, hyperspace, in order to make interstellar travel practical and to allow my plots to progress. Someday, this might become a reality. Very unlikely, I admit, but, in short, Flatland is not just an amusing and witty exercise in geometry, but in a dissertation that could lead to very profound thought about our universe and ourselves. Isaac Asimov. Okay, so that is the foreword. It kind of gives us a kind of a peephole into what's to come. So I have a better understanding of what's happening here. We're talking about dimensions, no dimensions, one dimension, and two dimensions, pointland, lineland, and flatland. 3 dimensions being our universe, and then he's going to make a kind of an analogous argument between Flatland and our universe to how we view our universe and the 4th dimension, or Einstein's so-called 4th dimension of time. Also dealing with the fact that there are limitations to a set of rules, or in their case, a universe. Like in Flatland, the rules, I guess in our universe, in 3 dimensions, as he said, the speed of light, you can't move past that. But in another universe, you can. And because you can, it introduces a whole nother set of laws. It kind of reminds me of, I can't remember what his name is. Gödel, that's his name. The logician Gödel, and how Gödel's incompleteness there, and where he proved that not every math problem is solvable, because due to the limitations of our mathematical system, we won't be able to solve it. And if we add a rule that would allow us to solve it, then we're dealing with a completely new set of we're dealing with a completely new universe. So it's a very interesting concept. But let's move forward into the introduction, and then we'll go through the preface, and then we'll start chapter 1 in the next video. So let's start. Introduction. In an address to the committee of the Cayley Portrait Fund in 1874, Clerk Maxwell, after referring in humorous terms to the work of Arthur Cayley in higher algebra and algebraical geometry, concluded his eulogium with the lines. I don't know how to pronounce the word. It's spelled Eulogium, if anyone knows. So In algebraic geometry, concluded his eulogium with these lines: "March on, symbolic host, with step sublime, up to the flaming bounds of space and time. There pause until by Dickinson depicted, in 2 dimensions we the form may trace, of him whose soul, too large for vulgar space, in n dimensions flourished unrestricted." In those days, any conception of dimensions beyond length, breadth, and height was confined to advanced mathematicians, and even among them, with very few exceptions, the 4th and higher dimensions afforded only a field for the practice of algebraical analysis with 4 or more variables instead of the 3 which sufficiently describe the space to which our foot rules are applicable. Any geometrical conclusions reached were regarded only as analogies to the corresponding results in geometry of 3 dimensions, and not as having any bearing on the system of nature. As an illustration, reference may be made to the more divine offspring of the divine cube in the land of 4 dimensions, mentioned on page 94. Infra, which has for its faces 8 3-dimensional cubes and possesses 16 4-dimensional angular points or corners. Okay, so I want to stop there and kind of break that down a little bit. So, a cube in our 3-dimensional world has 6 sides. And those 6 sides are 2-dimensional planes, 6 squares. And so a cube is made up of 6 2-dimensional planes. And what they're saying here is in 4 dimensions, we're going to have what's called a hypercube. And instead of 6 2-dimensional planes on each side, the sides will now consist of 6 cubes, 3-dimensional cubes, each with their own set of sides. And that's very hard to picture because if you try to visualize that, it wouldn't work because there wouldn't be enough space. But in 4 dimensions, there would be enough space to account for all of the cubes. So, just a little commentary there. During the present century, the work of Einstein, Lorentz, Larmor, Whitehead, and others has shown that at least 4 dimensions of space-time are necessary to account for the observed phenomena of nature, and there are some suggestions of the necessity for more than 4. It is only when dealing with very high velocities, such as are comparable with the velocity of light, that the unity of time with space thrusts itself upon the notice of physicists, for even with such a velocity as that of the planet Mercury, in its orbit, it is only after the lapse of centuries that any divergence from the motion strictly calculated on the basis of Euclidean geometry and Newton's laws of gravitation and of motion has become apparent. The observed behavior of electrons moving in high vacua, with velocities comparable with the velocity of light, has confirmed some of Einstein's conclusions and necessitated a revision of our fundamental notions of kinematics and the laws of motion when these high velocities are concerned. But the whole subject of relativity has strongly appealed to popular interest through the brilliant confirmation of Einstein's theory of gravitation by the bending of light in passing close to the sun's surface and the consequent apparent displacement of stars which are very close to the sun from their true relative position when photographed during a solar eclipse. The best popular exposition of the whole subject of relativity and gravitation is to be found in Professor Eddington's Space-Time and Gravitation. But when a great truth comes to light, it is generally found that there have already been prophets crying in the wilderness and preparing the way for the reception of the revelation when the full time has come. In an anonymous letter published in Nature on February 12, 1920, entitled Euclid, Newton, and Einstein, attention was called to such a prophet in the following words. Some 30 or more years ago, a little Jules d'Espéry was written by Dr. Edwin Abbott entitled Flatland. At the time of its publication, it did not attract as much attention as it deserved. Dr. Abbott pictures intelligent beings whose whole experience is confined to a plane or other space of 2 dimensions, who have no faculties by which they can become conscious of anything outside that space, and no means of moving off the surface on which they live. He then asks the reader, who has the consciousness of the 3rd dimension, to imagine a sphere descending upon the plain of Flatland and passing through it. How will the inhabitants regard this phenomena? They will not see the approaching sphere, and will have no conception of its solidity. They will only be conscious of the circle in which it cuts their plane. This circle, at first a point, will gradually increase in diameter, driving the inhabitants of Flatland outwards from its circumference, and this will go on until half the sphere has passed through the plane, when the circle will gradually contract to a point and then vanish, leaving the Flatlanders in undisturbed possession of their country. Their experience will be that of a circular obstacle, gradually expanding or growing and then contracting, and they will attribute to growth in time what the external observer in 3 dimensions assigns to motion in the 3rd dimension. Transfer this analogy to a movement of the 4th dimension through 3-dimensional space. Assume the past and future of the universe to be all depicted in 4-dimensional space and visible to any being who has consciousness of the 4th dimension. If there is motion of our 3-dimensional space relative to the 4th dimension, all the changes we experience and assign to the flow of time will be due simply to this movement, the whole of the future as well as the past always existing in the 4th dimension. It will be noticed that in the presentation of the sphere to the Flatlander, the 3rd dimension involves time through the motion of the sphere. In the space-time continuum of the theory of relativity, the 4th dimension is a time function and the simplest element in an event. One set of parallel sections of the 4-dimensional continuum present the universe as it exists in 3-dimensional space, at the instants corresponding to the sections. Sections in all other directions involve the time element and represent the universe as it appears to an observer in motion. There are some mathematical minds which are completely satisfied by the results expressed in algebraical symbols of the analysis of a continuum of 4 dimensions, but there are others which crave for the visualization of these results, which, in their symbolic forms, they do not question. To many, perhaps the great majority of these, Dr. Abbott's sphere penetrating Flatland's points the way to the clearest imaginary of the 4th dimension to which they are likely to obtain. W.M. Garnett. Okay, so that kind of fleshed out what Isaac Asimov was saying, although it's just giving more detail. So again, they're drawing an analogy from 2 to 3 dimensions, and then from 3 to 4. So how would a 4-dimensional sphere look passing into our dimension as a sphere would passing into 2 dimensions? It's a very interesting idea, and to be honest, one that I haven't really thought about a lot, but definitely will after this. Okay, so the last part of these introductory documents is the preface to the second and revised edition in 1984 by the editor. It's just a few pages, and I'd like to have it in this video so that we can start on part 1 in the next. So let's read this. If my poor Flatland friend retained the vigor of mind which he enjoyed when he began to compose these memoirs, I should not now need to represent him in this preface, in which he desires, firstly, to return his thanks to his readers and critics in Spaceland, whose appreciation has, with unexpected celerity, required a second edition of his work. Secondly, to apologize for certain errors and misprints, for which, however, he is not entirely responsible. And thirdly, to explain 1 or 2 misconceptions. But he is not the square he once was. Years of imprisonment and the still heavier burden of general incredulity and mockery have combined with the natural decay of old age to erase from his mind many of the thoughts and notions, and much also of the terminology, which he acquired during his short stay in Spaceland. He has, therefore, requested me to rely in his behalf to two special objections, one of an intellectual, the other of a more natural. The first objection is that a Flatlander, seeing a line, sees something that must be thick to the eye as well as long to the eye, otherwise it would not be visible, if it had not some thickness. And consequently, he ought, it is argued, to acknowledge that his countrymen are not only long and broad, but also, though doubtless in a very slight degree, thick or high. This objection is plausible, and to Spacelanders almost irresistible, so that, I confess, when I first heard it, I knew not what to reply. But my poor old friend's answer appears to me completely to meet it. "I admit," said he, when I mentioned to him this objection, "I admit the truth of your critic's facts, but I deny his conclusions. It is true that we have really in Flatland a third, unrecognized dimension called height, just as it is also true that you have really in Spaceland a fourth unrecognized dimension, called by no name at present, but which I will call extra height. But we can no more take cognizance of our height than you can of your extra height. Even I, who have been in Spaceland, and have had the privilege of understanding for 24 hours the meaning of height, even I cannot now comprehend it, nor realize it by the sense of sight, or by any process of reason. I can but apprehend it by faith. The reason is obvious. Dimension implies direction, implies measurement, implies the more and the less. Now all our lines are equally and infinitesimally thick, or high, whichever you like. Consequently, there is nothing in them to lead our minds to the conception of that dimension. No delicate micrometer, as has been suggested by one too hasty Spaceland critic, would in the least avail us, for which we should not know what to measure, nor in what direction. When we see a line, we see something that is long and brightness, as well as length, is necessary to the existence of line. If the brightness vanishes, the line is extinguished. Hence, all my Flatland friends, when I talk to them about the unrecognized dimension, which is somehow visible in a line, say, "Ah, you mean brightness," and when I reply, "No, I mean a real dimension," they at once retort, "Then measure it, or tell us in what direction it extends." And this silences me, for I can do neither. Only yesterday, when the chief circle, in other words, our high priest, came to inspect the state prison and paid me his 7th annual visit, and when, for the 7th time, he put me the question, was I any better? I tried to prove to him that he was high as well as long and broad, although he did not know it. But what was his reply? "You say I am high? Measure my highness, and I will believe you." What could I do? How could I meet his challenge? I was crushed, and he left the room triumphant. Does this seem strange to you? Then put yourself in a similar position. Suppose a person of the 4th dimension condescending to visit you where to stay. Whenever you open your eyes, you see a plane, which is of 2 dimensions, and you infer a solid, which is of 3. But in reality, you also see, though you do not recognize, a 4th dimension, which is not color nor brightness, nor anything of the kind, but a true dimension. Although I cannot point out to you its direction, nor can you possibly measure it, what would you say to such a visitor? Would you not have him locked up? Well, that is my fate, and it is as natural for us Flatlanders to lock up a square for preaching the 3rd dimension, as it is for you Spacelanders to lock up a cube for preaching the 4th. Alas, how strong a family likeness runs through blind and persecuting humanity in all dimensions. Points, lines, squares, cubes, extra cubes, we're all liable to the same errors, all alike the slaves of our respective dimensional prejudices. As one of your Spaceland poets has said, "One touch of nature makes all worlds akin." On this point, the defense of the square seems to me to be impregnable. I wish I could say that his answer to the second, or moral objection, was equally clear and cogent. It has been objected that he is a woman-hater, and as this objection has been vehemently urged by those whom nature's decree has constituted the somewhat larger half of the Spaceland race, I should like to remove it, so far as I can honestly do so. But the Square is so unaccustomed to the use of the moral terminology of Spaceland that I should be doing him an injustice if I were literally to transcribe his defense against this charge. Acting, therefore, as his interpreter and summarizer, I gather that in the course of an imprisonment of 7 years, he has himself modified his own personal views, both as regards women and as regards the isosceles or lower classes. Personally, he now inclines to the opinion of the sphere, see page 95, that the straight lines are in many important respects superior to the circle. But written as a historian, he identifies himself perhaps too closely with the views generally adopted by Flatland. And, as he has been informed even by Spaceland, historians, in whose pages until very recent times the destinies of women and of the masses of mankind have seldom been deemed worthy of mention and never of careful consideration. I just want to take a moment and stop before I finish this preface. There's a little note at the bottom of the page which refers back to something in the text. It refers back to the poem that one of the Spaceland poets said, "One touch of nature makes all worlds akin." The note reads, "The author desires me to add that the misconception of some of his critics on this matter has induced him to insert, on page 80 and 102, in his dialogue with the sphere, certain remarks which have had a bearing on the point in question, which he has previously omitted as being tedious and unnecessary." I just thought I would put that in there to just be complete. Let's continue. In a still more obscure passage, he now desires to disavow the circular or aristocratic tendencies with which some critics have naturally credited him, while doing justice to the intellectual power with which a few circles have for many generations maintained their supremacy over immense multitudes of their countrymen. He believed the facts of Flatland speaking for themselves, without comment on his part, declare that revolutions cannot always be suppressed by slaughter, and that nature, in sentencing the circles to infecundity. Let me try one more time. Infecundity has condemned them to ultimate failure, and herein, he says, I see a fulfillment of the great law of all worlds, that while to the wisdom of man thinks it is working one thing, the wisdom of nature constrains it to work another, and quite a different and far better thing. For the rest, he begs his readers not to suppose that every minute detail in the daily life of Flatland must needs correspond to some other detail in Spaceland, and that he hopes that taken as a whole his work may prove suggestive as well as amusing to those Spacelanders of moderate and modest minds who, speaking of that which is of the highest importance but lies beyond experience, decline to say, on the one hand, this can never be, and on the other hand, it must needs be precisely thus, and we all know about it. Okay, so that concludes the preface. Just a few thoughts about that. It started off talking about how even when we're thinking about, they give the example of a two-dimensional line, we impose upon it another dimension. If we're being accurate here, a line doesn't have, width, right? It just has length, but we impose its width. And analogous to that, a square has width and length, but we, although not as commonly as a line, impose a height to it. So that's what he started off saying. And then later on he started talking about women, and I kind of lost it, but I'm sure it will be explained during the actual part of the book. So stay tuned for the next video, where we will start part 1 of Flatland, A Romance of Many Dimensions. Thank you for listening.